Welcome to McMaster University. My name is Joe Kim, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to welcome you to the 5th annual McMaster Symposium on Education and Cognition. I'd like to acknowledge a few of the sponsors which helped make this event possible, including the McPherson Institute and the Faculty of Science, the Alumni Association, who am I forgetting? And the Office of the President. If you use social media and you'd like to add your commentary, please use the hashtag EdCog 2017. The plan for this evening is that we will hear we'll hear from Terry Sejnowski, who will deliver the public lecture. Immediately following, we'll have a discussion panel consisting of speakers at our EdCog Symposium who will deliver their plenaries tomorrow. And to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight, I'd like to call upon the Associate Vice President of Teaching and Learning and the Director of the McPherson Institute, Arshad Ahmad.
Maybe it's okay. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. That's great. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this auspicious lecture that kicks off the 2017 Symposium on Education and Cognition. So many years ago, tonight's speaker, Terry Sejnowski, was being, I believe, trained to be the next Einstein, something like that. As a graduate student in physics at Princeton, Terry worked on relativity theory with the legendary John Wheeler, who in turn worked with this guy who, well, invented relativity. And that would be, of course, Albert Einstein. So all of this to say that Terry was a bright, promising star right from the get-go. By the way, Terry, McMaster is actually home to part of Einstein's brain. I don't know if you knew that. I'm told it's locked up somewhere. Researchers are still trying to figure out the interior, or is it inferior, parietal lobe? Parietal lobe, sorry, can't pronounce that. Which is apparently, or which was apparently 15% larger than normal size. Which I guess where all the thinking of the general theory of relativity happened. Anyway, just a fun little fact for you to feel connected with McMaster. Ladies and gentlemen, working in Einstein's footsteps wasn't enough for Terry. He wanted to make more of a personal impact on people's lives, and so Terry quite dramatically changed fields to a discipline that was so new, it barely had a name. Terry chose to become one of the world's early neuroscientists at a time when this sounded exciting, but few had a clue about its directions. So it was a pretty risky move, but one, of course, with great long-term rewards. Terry is now the Francis Crick Chair and the head of the Computational Neurobiology Laboratory at the Salk Institute in San Diego. He has remarkably this cross-disciplinary intellect, and it's reflected in the fact that he is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Medicine. Only a handful of people on Earth have this extraordinary capacity, and so it's not surprising that Terry is also a pioneer in the field of artificial intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in acknowledging and welcoming neuroscientist extraordinaire, Dr. Terry Sejnowski.
Thank you. It is indeed a great honor for my brain to be here in the same place with Albert Einstein's, even though, of course, in a different state. So, we're living at a really critical moment in the history of the world that I think will go down in the history books in the same way that, for example, relativity marked an era where humans, for the first time, began to understand the nature of the universe. We are beginning to understand, for the first time, the nature of our brains. And we're facing a problem. It's actually a crisis. The problem is that we now have computers and data capabilities of collecting data that is so great that it is drowning us. There's a deluge of data. It's coming into every science, into every company throughout the world. And it's increasing at the level of zettabytes. It's like 10 to the 18th every year on the internet. And there's a problem. How do you deal with it? I was at the live lab earlier this morning, and I was told that in a single experiment they can collect terabytes, and there's so much information there that it takes them a year to analyze it. And that's one experiment, right? That's one of many experiments that are being done there. And so it's really a problem of how to extract from all the data information. Information is not the same as data. It's like refined data. But information itself is not as valuable as being able to convert that into knowledge, right? Knowledge is telling you something about the world, something that you didn't know. But knowledge itself isn't the goal, it's understanding. And that, of course, derives from knowledge. And ultimately, you have to understand, of all the knowledge you have, what is the most important. Of course, that requires wisdom. This is a pipeline, and the pipeline is just beginning, and now we're at the very early stage of converting data to information. By the way, this is not new in the world, because every baby that comes into the world has exactly the same problem. The brain is being exposed to a fire hose of sensory information coming in from all the senses. The baby's brain has to incorporate that, integrate that into some kind of an internal representation of what's me and what's the world. And that takes a lot of experience. Interactions with other humans, with the mother, are extremely important. Touch turns out to be critical. If a baby isn't smoothly stroked early in life, it will have social deficits later. So the baby and the brain, nature has solved the problem of the data deluge. And we might be able to get some hints into how to handle ours if we take advantage of the increasing knowledge of the brain through neuroscience. Now, at the same time that all this is going on, there was a small group of researchers going back to the 1980s who started a annual meeting called Neural Information Processing Systems. I know there's one person in the room here who's gone to almost all of the meetings here, Simon Haken. And what came out of this meeting was quite remarkable because it was very interdisciplinary. There were neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, physicists, mathematicians, engineers, people studying vision, people studying speech recognition, and of course they all spoke different languages, so it was a little bit like Tower of Babel. But over the last 30 years, something really amazing has come out of this group, which is the beginnings of what I think are a revolution, both in terms of understanding how to analyze data, big data, and how to extract from that information, and how to use these new tools that we've developed, how to use them to develop a deeper understanding of our own brain. And that's what I want to tell you about today. By the way, the last meeting was held last December in Barcelona. 6,000 attendees. You know, we were bursting at the seams. 65 corporate sponsors, every single major information company was there. They were there because they were recruiting. Everybody wants to start up a machine learning group, which is really the premier meeting for machine learning, academic meeting. More of the to come in a little bit. So about 10 years ago, we started a Science of Learning Center based at UCSD, but involving 18 institutions. And this was a science paper that came out of some early thinking about what's new, what can we bring to the table that wasn't already there. Psychology already has a long-standing relationship with education. There's a big literature, and we know a lot about behavior. But really, what we're bringing to the table in our center at UCSD was the temporal dynamics that derives from understanding the signals that are going through the brain and how that information gets incorporated into memory and how memory, in turn, gives rise to behavior, cognitive behaviors, knowledge. But as you can see, there's actually another important direction here, and that is machine learning. And we were very early on, this is 10 years ago, very early on recognized that we're going to be dealing here with big data sets, high dimensional spaces, and as we collected it, as we analyzed it, we wanted to relate it directly to the other legs of this educational spectrum. And I'm going to just give you one of many examples that is, I think, particularly salient, and that is how, if you wanted to communicate with an 18-month-old toddler, how would you go about doing it? And you know, the teachers, they're running around, they're rambunctious, they will pick up a toy and they'll throw it down, they have very short attention spans. And the teachers have trouble just keeping control of all the activity going around because, you know, they don't sit down necessarily when you ask them to. And so we developed in our center a social robot called Ruby. And here's an early version, here's a later version, but basically the idea is that this is a robot that is going to interact with the toddlers on their own terms. You know, with action, with eyes, with hands. This is a project that was started by Javier Movellin, and really very important insights that came out of this, but not the ones we expected. In other words, we learned more from this experiment than we were able to deliver to the educational establishment. And so I'll just give you a very brief insight. Well, the first thing that happened, as you can see, is the boys would run over to Ruby, grab the hand, yank it, and break it. Now, of course, you know, what else would a little boy do? Well, back to the shop. Now, the hands were purposely not made robust, and the reason is that you didn't want an industrial hand there because that could be very dangerous. So it took a little bit of thinking. The next time they rolled Ruby out there, what they did was they put a pressure sensor on the arm, and the minute it went to a point where it was getting dangerous, Ruby would cry. Now, immediately the boys backed off, and the girls ran in and hugged Ruby. and this is really social engineering, and I think that this is what we learned. We learned is that if you want to get the attention of a child, you have to have joint attention. You have to, if the child points to something, Ruby has to look at it. If the child puts something in Ruby's hand, Ruby has to clasp it and look at it. And this magic happens. Once that happens, the kids love Ruby. And interestingly, so did the teachers, because it basically helped the teacher control the class. So it was a great experiment. Unfortunately, it had to end because Javier was, he started a company that was called Emotion, which used deep learning to be able to, in real time, determine what facial expressions a person was having. And Apple bought the company, so he's now an employee of Apple. But what we wanted to do was to start a whole new line of experiments. The idea was, let's have 1,000 rubies in 1,000 schools throughout the entire United States, in many socioeconomic districts, and collect every day data from 1,000 experiments, and see what the diversity is like, and see how different children, different places react. So this is something that I hope will happen in the future, but right now we don't have the resources to do that. Now, something else happened. I would just say that it personally was very frustrating for me, because as soon as we had something that we thought was really hot, like Ruby, we ran up against brick walls. By the way, this was an early child education center on the campus, and so we had complete access to the classrooms. It was great. But you just can't go into a random classroom and start setting up a social robot. It's very complicated. The schools, the principals, the school districts, the unions, it was just, bureaucracy is just extremely difficult to work with, and of course there are 12,000 school districts, and so even if you had something that would be guaranteed to work, it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to get it into the classroom. But something happened along the way which we didn't anticipate. I didn't anticipate. And this was in 2011. There was a course at Stanford University. It was being taught by Peter Norvig, who's at Google, and Sebastian Thrun, who was then AI computer scientist at Stanford. And they put a machine learning course online, an AI course, and they had 58,000 people sign up, which are unbelievable numbers at the time in terms of the number of people that were taking the course, and also indicated the interest in machine learning. And this opened up massively open online courses. It meant that we could do an end run around the establishment and get into people's homes. Anyone with the internet access had free access to this course. Now, of course, this led to a course that Barbara Oakley and I started, and she's already talked about it. So let me give you the backstory of how it actually came about, because it's an interesting story. So I met Barbara at a conference that was sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences up the road at UC Irvine. And we had dinner together, and it turned out she had a really deep interest in education, and I told her about our Science of Learning Center. I invited her to come and give a talk. And here she is, TDLC. And we invited high school teachers and high school students. It was about the same size as we have here. And it was dynamite. She had the students eating from her hand, just like she had us eating from her hand this morning. It was clear she's a gifted educator, and she had these great ideas. And from discussions that we had, it became clear that, gee, this would be perfect to have a course based on the kinds of things she was working on that seemed to be very effective and were able to inspire younger people. So that became learning how to learn. Okay, today, of course, with over 2 million learners, it's been an extraordinarily popular, and it's really blossomed off in many different directions that you'll probably hear about more tomorrow. Now, in terms of evidence-based education, it's very hard to come by. The reason is it's hard to do experiments. If they're expensive, the whole of education is very diverse in terms of the different school districts, the teachers in them, because they all have different criteria for, being able to, what the curriculum is going to be and what the credentials for the teachers. And then, of course, the students are all different, right? And so how do you do an experiment in one school and replicate it in another? Because it's unlikely that you're going to have the same circumstances. But there have been a number of studies, and this was a summary of a study that just came out recently, and it was picked up by The Economist in July, and it was July 22nd. If anybody's interested, you can look it up. It's on newsstands right now. But it was a summary of 42 randomized controlled trials. Now, what is a randomized controlled trial? This is the gold standard in medicine. If you want to prove that your drug is better than anybody else's, then what you do is you take the patients and split them into two groups randomly. that are matched in terms of age and what their physical health is and so forth. And then one half gets the drug and the other half gets a placebo. And then you see the outcome and you see whether or not there's a difference. And the idea is that all other things being equal, if you see that the people with the drug are doing better, then it may have some advantage. Of course, often the drug is worse than the placebo. So if you didn't do this study, of course, you wouldn't know that. Now, the reason why you need to do it randomly and with a placebo is that it turns out that placebo by itself will actually benefit the patient. Because if the patient thinks he's going to get better, often they are better. And that's, somehow the mind is able to interact with the body in such a way to make something happen, and it's real. And the reason we know it's real is that there's a drug that you can take which actually blocks the placebo effect. It's part of the opioid pathway. Okay, well, look, I just want to, this is a summary of 42 studies, and I just want to point out, first of all, what they're showing here is how much better this trial did compared to the controls. And this is in terms of standard deviations. So this is roughly a half a standard deviation, which is very large. We're talking here about, if you take the bell-shaped curve, right, it's the midpoint, halfway point. And here's, first of all, the gold standard, okay, and this has been replicated again many, many times in many different conditions. By far the best way for a student to learn new material is one-on-one interactions with a gifted teacher who is able to work with the child and get to know the child's background in terms of what the child knows, what the child doesn't know, and tailor the instruction for that child, personalized education. The trouble is that it's very expensive. For example, here we go, intensive tutoring, including cognitive behavioral therapy, through the whole kitchen sink at the child, and lo and behold, yes, you can get a half a standard deviations. And this has been, again, over and over again. This is not a surprise. However, look at the cost per child per year, $4,400. That's very expensive, and not everybody can afford that. Well, let's look up here. These are computer-aided learning interventions. This is ways that the child can interact with a computer program. And it turns out that in India, and this is after 2 years of remedial games, I'm not sure exactly what the games were, but they were also able to achieve almost a half a standard deviation for $15 per student per year. So this, at least in terms of scaling something up from a small pilot study to something larger, this looks very attractive. And as you can see, all these games that were listed here for these particular studies, something in the games must have been, something in the programs are helping kids in various ways, both for algebra and for other sorts of areas that kids have trouble with. Okay, so this is setting the stage. I think personalized education is the way to go. We're going to have a panel discussion about that. Is it feasible? And if so, how should we go about doing it? But now what I want to do is to give you a perspective on what's happening right now. The tsunami is coming. What should we be doing to anticipate it? What impact is it going to have on society? And in order to put it into perspective, let's take a look at the last few hundred years of science and technology. So if you look back at the 20th century, it was clear that the first half was the great age of discovery of fundamental theory, relativity, we heard about that in the introduction, quantum mechanics. And this gave rise to all of the fantastic devices we have now in this century: computers, cell phones, smartphones. This is really built on physics, basic physics. But it took, 50 to 100 years for it to translate from theory all the way down to commercial enterprise. 50 to 100 years, that's the long time scale. Now, what about the second half of the 20th century? Well, in 1953, Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. And it became clear to biologists that this was a whole new era of biology was beginning, because now you can begin to see things like how cells replicate, evolution through mutation. I mean, all of that was laid bare. But it took 50 years to develop the tools and techniques to do that. The Human Genome Project created new machines that could sequence genes more efficiently than labor-intensive techniques that were used in labs, automated it, and now it's possible to sequence the genome for about $1,000. And basically, everybody's going to be sequenced over the next 50 years, eventually, and has valuable information about individual prognosis. And it took 50 years to 100 years for all of that to play out. Now, what about today? What's going on today? Can we characterize our own age? Right? It was physics and biology. And here's what I think will be characterized by, say, 100 years from now, looking back, just the way we look back at physics. I think that we will be called the information age. And this is in many different areas at the same time. I've already alluded to computer science. That we wouldn't be able to store this much information if the computers hadn't gotten a million times faster in the last 30 years. Or data storage. I was talking to Joe about a little memory stick, and he said, "Oh, it's the gigabyte." No, it's actually 4 gigabytes, right? Well, I'll tell you, when I was working in the 80s, a couple of megabytes was considered a lot of memory, and so look where we are now—a little stick, right? Thousands of times more memory, and it probably costs $10. Okay, well, neuroscience is really blossoming right now. It's in a revolution, and I'll tell you more about it. But ultimately, it's the brain that is the information organ that provides us with both the memory, the knowledge, and the wisdom to create whole new tracts of science, of history, of everything that you can imagine that we do, that humans do. We have language, we have culture, and it all comes out of our brain. And finally, just within the last 5 years, in fact, in 3 years, deep learning has burst on the scene. You've probably been reading about it in newspapers. How many people here, if you've heard the word deep learning, put up your hand? Okay, has anybody here heard of the word shallow learning? Well, I want to give you a little bit of history, and it actually does start out with shallow learning, because that's what I used to do 30 years ago. And the story really starts back at Cornell, when Frank Rosenblatt developed the simplest possible neural network, based loosely on neurons, but actually a cartoon version of neurons. And here's how it worked. There are a bunch of inputs, and you can think of these as pixels on an image, or you can think of them as features that were collected in your data set. And these are weighted by numbers. These are just, this could be 1.5, this could be 2.2. And then the sum is compared to a threshold, theta, and if it's above threshold, the output is 1, and if it's below that, it's 0. And this is basically a classifier. And the goal is to be able to classify, say, images into 2 categories. For example, is this a cat or not? Right? Or another one could be, is this a cup or not? And what made this really powerful was that he developed a learning algorithm, that is to say, a way of automatically changing these strengths here, so that on every trial, if you got it wrong, you could improve it next time. And as it converged, it would not only would it classify the examples you gave it, but it would be able to generalize to new examples. And that's the key, is generalization. Because if you just want to store it, computers can do that just fine. It's when you get a new instance that is similar to, but not the same, that you want your system to be able to recognize. And there's an infinite number of possible cats, an infinite number of possible cups. And one of the failures of AI, traditional AI, which is based on logic and symbol processing, is that nobody was ever able to write down a logical statement which would unambiguously characterize what a cat is or a cup. It's just too nebulous. It would take you forever to do it, and even if you could do it, you would have to do it for hundreds of thousands of objects in the world, and that's very labor-intensive and expensive. But I'm going to give you an example of how the perceptron can solve a problem that you solve very efficiently. Most of us can solve very efficiently, and the perceptron can also solve it. This is a little project that I worked on when I first got to the Salk Institute back in the 80s, called SexNet. And here's the goal. We had a set of images of faces where we were able to crop it so that you didn't know what the hairline was like or what the secondary sexual characteristics are like. And the question is this a male or female? So how many people here, this is a female? Okay, quite a few of you. How many people think it's a male? Okay, well, a lot fewer. So here's the question. How did you come to that conclusion? You seem to be very sure of yourself. People they didn't do this, they went like this or like this, right? How did you figure it out? Well, it turns out there isn't any simple feature. There are features all over the face that help discriminate. And by applying these images to a perceptron, we're able to actually show you the weights that the perceptron used to weight each pixel in one direction or another. So it turns out that the male here is going to be 1, positive, and then evidence for female is negative. So these are the negative pixels, that's the positive pixel. The most informative part of the face turns out to be the philtrum between the nose and the mouth, and it's bigger in males. And this is true, if you look around the room, you'll see this. Like, Simon has a huge philtrum. But there are other areas of the face, for example, cheekbones. Women have very prominent cheekbones, and so it's weighted in the opposite direction. So that would get evidence for females. And so each pixel here contributes. And so this is a weighted average over all that information that's available to you. And it really, now we see the face of sex. This is something your brain can do very well, and even the perceptron can do it at about the same level that the human can do it. Now, here's the problem. Marvin Minsky, who is the founder of the AI lab at MIT, published a book in 1969 with Seymour Papert. And it was a brilliant mathematical treatise which analyzed the capabilities of the perceptron and showed that there were a whole class, that it only could solve a class of problems that are technically called first-order predicates. And this is where you can pass a plane between the positive and negative examples. And that turns out to be a very limited number of problems. And what they said was that, it's a very beautiful theory, but in fact it's very limited. And here's, at the end of the book, they say there is no reason to suppose that any of these virtues carry over to the many-layered version. This killed neural networks for a generation. Brought it to a complete standstill. No funding, no jobs. Who would ever go into it? Fortunately, if the research had continued, someone else would have just made all the discoveries that Jeff Hinton and I and others made in the 80s. So I'm really grateful to Marvin for stopping research so that I could catch up. Made my career possible. Thank you, Marvin. So I want to give you an example of a project that we did using one of the learning algorithms. Jeff and I worked on something called the Boltzmann machine. We proved that you can do these multi-layer perceptrons with hidden units between the input and output layer. And the particular algorithm that we used is called backpropagation, which is still used, very popular. And I just want to give you an example so you can actually hear for yourself how it works. So here's the problem. The problem is to take input text letter by letter and convert it into a sound. These are phonemes. So for example, the goal of the network is to attach to the letter N here the N sound, right? And if it makes a mistake, then what you do is you backpropagate the error through the network to change the weights so that the hidden units have different features that can distinguish it. So the next time you get the same sequence of letters, you're going to be able to come closer to the true sound. Now, here's the thing. It was a window of 7 letters that was moved through one at a time. The network only had a few hundred units, about 10,000 connection strengths. And that's because our computers back then were about 1 million times slower. And this is a big network for that time. So let me give you a sense for how it learned. I'm going to play a little clip at the very beginning of learning, so you can judge for yourself what the learning process was going on. Is that all? Let's try once more. Okay, well, I've memorized it. Ba, ba, ga, 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 da, da. Okay, so it learns at the beginning to use the same vowel for every vowel, but it will vary the consonant. So it babbles, and it will go on for a long time until it sort of begins to pick up what the consonants are. Differences between consonants are more subtle than the vowels. Vowels themselves are very ambiguous too. And then, after a night of learning, this is what it sounded like, and we actually are using it now to read a page of text from a first grader.
With two rays or sometimes we had to run home from school now.
I think that it's maybe too loud. Let me put it down a little bit. Okay, here we go. Okay, you mean like England or something? When we walk home from school, I walk home with two friends, and sometimes we can't run home from school. I mean, you get the idea. It's actually understandable. You know, not with my accent, though. Okay, this is fantastic, and it actually got on the Today Show on NBC, and got a lot of attention, and suddenly people began to pay attention to this whole new approach to AI. The trouble was we only had these little toy projects, and we really didn't have enough computer power to really see where it was going to go. But I was very pleased when I was asked to give a distinguished lecture at MIT, the Computer Sciences Lab. It was Michael Dertouzis, who's the director, invited me to give a lecture, and so I arrived in the morning. We had a nice discussion about the future of computers, and he has written a book, and so he said, we have a tradition here. We have the department and the AI lab. We have a lunch with the distinguished visitor, and there'll be a little dialogue before lunch, where we have a discussion about topics of the day. And as we're going up the elevator, just as the door is about to open, he says, "And they hate what you do." And here I am, right? I have no preparation. I have no idea who's going to be in the room. And he says, "Oh my, everybody is here." There was a senior faculty was the first ring, and then the second ring was junior faculty. Behind them were the students, right? And I was in the middle. And it just came to me. It just came to me. I said, "What can you possibly say for give me 5 minutes. What could you possibly say?" And it just came to me. Do you see that fly in the corner? That's flying around there? Well, that fly has 100,000 neurons compared to yours, which you have 100 billion. But that fly can see, it can fly, it can mate, and reproduce itself. You have a supercomputer downstairs that costs you $100 million. It can't see, it can't fly, and these computers have been talking to each other for a long time, and they haven't mated yet or reproduced. What's wrong with this picture? Dead silence. This is the cream of American AI here we're talking about, right? This is a question that anybody in my lab could actually have answered on the spot. Well, one of the senior faculty put their hand and said, "Well, we haven't written the vision program yet." Well, it turned out DARPA had just finished a strategic computing program where they spent like $1 billion to be able to have a computer vision system for a tank. And it was an utter failure when all the generals were in the stands and the tank is going down the road. The sun went behind a cloud and the tank turned toward the generals. Vision is very difficult. It turns out that it's very easy for us, but very difficult to write a program because it's so complex, very complex. And for the reasons I gave, generalization is the most difficult thing. I mean, if you take a cup, it can be any size, any orientation, millions of different styles of cups, with one handle or two handles, and it just goes on and on and on, right? There's an infinite variety. Well, okay, so I want to flash forward now 30 years, and it's now going to be from the 80s now to the 10s, the beginning of the century. And now we know a lot more about the brain. And one of the things we know is that in the visual system, there's a hierarchy of visual areas that's like 12 deep. There are 24 different maps of the visual world, different parts of the cortex. About half of our cortex is visual. We're very visual animals. That's why we have so much computing power. That's why we can see so well, right? We have primates in general and humans in particular. And so it's clear what was wrong with our old networks. They only had one layer. But now, computers are a million times faster. And data, you need lots of data. Labeled data is basically a big supply of that on the internet. And so here we are. This is the two heroes, Jeff Hinton on the left and Yann LeCun. Yann LeCun created a network model, deep learning network model called the Convolutional Network, or ConvNet, which was then used by Jeff Hinton and his students to solve a very difficult problem. Just let me show you what it looks like. So here is the network. There's an image, and each one of these units here has input from a little patch, like 10 by 10. And there may be many layers here, many different features, similar to what you see in the visual system, where you see in the visual cortex there are oriented edge filters with different orientations and many very localized features. But then as you go up the hierarchy, because of the fact that there's going to be fan-out, the units are going to be able to respond over a larger and larger region until finally at the end, and this could be dozens of layers deep, you're looking at the whole image, and now you're able to recognize objects by doing back propagation from the labels back all the way through the entire network. And at a NIPS meeting that was, of all places, Lake Tahoe, where of course, they do a lot of gambling. In 2013, Jeff announced that he had achieved a world record performance on ImageNet. ImageNet was kind of the gold standard at the time. It consisted of 22,000 categories, all sorts of things, different kinds of birds and so forth. And there were like 20 million labeled images. And so he showed that with this ConvNet, he was able to reduce the error by 20%. Now, to calibrate that, on a good year, the image processing computer vision community can improve by about 0.5%, reduce the error by 0.5%. And so this is equivalent to about 40 years of normal research, literally, all at once. And once this became known, basically, there was no competitors, and now a version of this now is reached the point where the errors are down to a few percent. It's really very, very dramatic what an impact has had just on the last few years. And also, with this illustrates something very important, which is that the reason why it works is because you're able to use probability rather than logic in order to be able to extract features that are discriminative and also that are able to generalize, so that when you get to the very top, it's going to be easy to put a plane. Turns out the very last layer is like a perceptron, that things are separated in this high-dimensional space so that you can separate important categories. And now it's interesting because that got into the New York Times, and then suddenly everybody heard about it. What is deep learning, so forth. But it was just the beginning. And what's happened since then is that it's just gotten better and better. It's unbelievable. Let me give you an example. The next year, the deep learning network, which could recognize all the objects in a scene like this, was fed into a recurrent neural network. A recurrent neural network has feedback connections in it so that the information circulates. And that means you can do sequences. Sequences of inputs, sequences of outputs, rather than just a one trial feed-forward label. And so here's the output of one of these feed-forward networks that's been trained to caption images. It saw many images, many captions, and now it's doing one it's never seen before. So a group of people shopping at an outdoor mart. Pretty good. Here are some more examples. And in this particular case, it's highlighting in the image the region which a particular word corresponds to. So this is a frisbee. It recognized that. A woman is throwing a frisbee in a park. Pretty good. A dog is standing on the hardwood floor. Well, I'm not sure if it's standing, but it's certainly there on the floor. A group of people sitting on a boat in the water. Dead on. I mean, it's phenomenal that it could actually put out a perfectly normal sentence, right? So it must know something about English, first of all, so that it gets the right word order, which is something that linguists have been worried about for a long time. Now, it didn't stop with that. Speech recognition is another holy grail in AI, right? Up until recently, it was basically limited vocabulary, small numbers of speakers, but now and Microsoft was actually the first company to be able to develop a very deep network that was able to reach the point where it was approaching human performance. And this is Rick Rashid, who's the chief scientist at Microsoft, who's giving a talk in China. And this is a simultaneous translation, this is a simultaneous transcription into English words of what he was saying. This came from interestingly, it was a graduate student of Jeff Hinton who went there to do an internship for the summer and revolutionized their whole speech recognition group. Today, this is Alexa. There are 3 million Alexas in people's houses, homes, and if you have an Android, it's using deep learning to do your speech recognition. And Alexa is getting to the point, it's getting better and better because the AI is now being incorporated into products that you have in your home. Language translation. Last November, Google switched from their phrase-based, which is translating a small group of 2 or 3 words into another language, and instead of piecing them together, it was kind of choppy. But now it's doing whole sentence-based translation using deep learning, these recurrent networks I showed you about, and it's phenomenally good. In fact, people who do translation routinely say that it's so good that it's really reached the point where you can rely on it. It's perfectly understandable. And this was completely something I would have never predicted in 30 years ago. Because language has always been kind of the most complex of human behaviors, right? I mean, it's something that's unique to humans. But here we have these networks that seem to have capabilities, both in terms of generating sentences, translating sentences, and recognizing speech. These are all things that we thought only humans could do. Right now, it's basically standard operating procedure. I should have known about this because, look, if my little tiny network can do phonology, then, just scaling it up, then that's really what we discovered over the last 30 years is that these algorithms, learning algorithms, scale beautifully. The bigger the network, the better the performance. The more layers you have, the better the performance. And there's very, very few algorithms in the world that scale this well. Most of the traditional AI algorithms for search, for example, blow up exponentially. And so it's not practical for a big problem. Okay, so this is good. We have a model here for maybe how the cortex, the visual cortex works. So you have this fantastic pattern recognizer up there. We know that. But there's more to life than pattern recognizing, right? You want to be able to actually have a goal. You want to accomplish something. And it turns out the part of the brain that is responsible for goal-directed behavior is called the basal ganglia, and it lies just below the cortex, gets input from the entire cortical mantle, and we now know that its job is to take all the sensory information and all the motor information that you're interacting with the world with and come up with a value assessment for how good am I doing. And if I want to do another step, what's the likely reward I'm going to get? Am I likely to solve the problem? Am I likely to, at the end of a sequence of movements, to reach, for the thing I'm trying to get to? And back in 1994, Reed Montague and Peter Dayan, two postdocs in my lab, suggested that the dopamine neurons, which were in the midbrain, they project into the basal ganglia and the cortical mantle, that these might be implementing an algorithm that Rich Sutton, who's here in Alberta, Edmonton University, I think? University of Alberta. What? University of Alberta. Oh, okay, University of Alberta. Okay, I got that right. Rich Sutton developed this algorithm in '88 called temporal difference learning. I'm not going to go into the details. I can say that what you do is you just apply this over and over again, and then you create a value function that allows you to make decisions And we know in the brain, the dopamine neurons are really important for motivation. Every addictive drug acts on the dopamine system by either increasing the amount of dopamine released or blocking reuptake, right? So in a sense, what addictive drugs do is they hijack the brain. Instead of the brain being directed by a goal that is out there that is really important, it's being hijacked to look for more drugs. And of course, this is going to be self-defeating. Okay, well, it turns out that there's a lot of evidence now that this is actually happening in your brain. It's called a reward prediction error. And the idea is that if you get more reward than you expect, then you have to increase the weights. And if you get less reward than you expected, you decrease the weights. And eventually, if you have enough experience, you'll be able to develop a plan to get a reward in the future. So Jerry Tesaro, who was another postdoc of mine, applied this to backgammon. By this time, he had left and gone to T.J. Watson, IBM in New York. And he was looking for a game that he could apply neural networks to. And he hit on backgammon because it's a really interesting game. First of all, you have to roll the dice. So there's some randomness involved. It's not like chess or Go. And it has to do with moving your pieces forward and bearing them off. And of course, the other opponent is going the opposite direction, and there's a conflict in the middle there. So I'm not going to go into the details except to say that it worked remarkably well. And in fact, in the way that he got it to work, there wasn't a lot of labeled data around, so he got the program to play itself over and over again. And at the beginning it was flailing, but eventually it figured out how to finish the end game by bearing off, and then it figured out how to set up defenses, and then it figured out how to strategize so that it had an advantage at the beginning. So this is an amazing thing. It took hundreds of thousands of trials, and at this point he didn't know how good it was because it was better than anybody at IBM. And Bill Roberti and others heard about this, and they came and played. And in 51 games, it lost 13 points, or about a quarter point per game. And at this point, Bill said, this is by far the best backgammon program we've ever seen, because most of them are really poor amateurs. And this is reaching professional level. So it played more games, it got better, and finally, after 1.5 million, Bill Roberti came back. He's written books on positional play. This guy is kind of a world-leading expert. It played him to a standstill. He said it was playing so well that at this point, with some good rolls, it could probably beat the world champion. And that's amazing because it was using a one-layer neural network. So what would happen if we amped it up with deep learning? We now know. Back in March, a year ago, a program called AlphaGo that was designed by DeepMind in London, later bought by Google, for $500 million. It used exactly the same algorithms. It used deep learning for the value function and another one for policy function, what moves to make. And it also had the temporal difference learning, and it played itself hundreds of millions of times. And again, at this point, they didn't know how strong it was, so they had a match with E.C. Dahl, who was the South Korean champion, eight-time world champion. And E.C. Dahl didn't really take it too seriously because there has never been any Go program that could even come close to playing at the Potzer level. It's a difficult problem. The board is 19 by 19. It's much more difficult than chess. In fact, the number of possible game positions is greater than the number of atoms in the universe. Right? This is ultimate game in terms of complexity. And just basically, you have to put your stones down and try to surround your enemy. And so the strategy is, it's not just a single battle in a corner. It's basically, there's battles going on all over the place that interact with each other, which makes them even more complex, right? This is like a world war. Okay, E.C. Dahl lost the first 3 out of 5 games, which means he lost to AlphaGo. And here's what he said at the press conference. I should have shown a better result, a better outcome, and better content in terms of the game played. And I do apologize for not being able to satisfy a lot of people's expectations. I kind of felt powerless. In the third game, AlphaGo made a move that no human had ever made before. It was just out of the blue, and it turned out to be decisive. EC-Doll sit there and looked at it for 10 minutes. He was just completely, it was creative. It was creating new moves that no human had ever made before. And it was doing that at the highest level. Now, fortunately for humanity, EC-Doll won the fourth game, saving our face. But he lost the fifth. Now, it turns out EC-Doll was not the world champion. The world champion is Qi Ji, Chinese, who is a 19-year-old prodigy. This guy is unbelievable. He has a Go mind, that is just unbelievable. By the way, these Go players at the highest level are rock stars in Asia. I mean, they're known, they're kind of public figures. Everybody knows them, and it's like, Muhammad Ali here, I mean, that kind of level of fame. And so when EC-Doll loses, it's like everybody knows it. So here's, right after he beat, AlphaGo beat EC-Doll, Qi Ji, who was the world champion, had beaten EC-Doll by 18 out of 20 games, said, well, okay, he can beat the Korean, but AlphaGo can't beat me. Real bravado. Now, unbeknownst to EC-Doll was to Qi Ji was that this program, AlphaGo 2.0, was now on the web server. It beat him 3 games, and it beat 60 out of 60 games it played online. It won all 60. Now this is by January it had been playing probably 1 billion games. Who knows how many? And here's what when he found out, here's what he said, January 5th. After humanity spent thousands of years improving our tactics, computers tell us that humans are completely wrong. Because now it was just like it had even gotten another step up. And in just a few months later in May, the Chinese put on a big tournament, and it was all the national TV. It was like real time. I mean, and this guy is like, not just a rock star. He's kind of like, he's so young and is so good at something, right? He's kind of like the Tiger Woods of golf, but it's at a much deeper level. Go, by the way, is like an art form, and they're professionals. I mean, it's like golf in China. Okay, so in May, they set up a tournament. He lost 3 out of 3. And here's what he said at the press conference. AlphaGo is the god of Go. Okay, now let's put things in perspective now. Let's go back to a very important essay that Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, wrote back in 1971 for the New York Review of Books. I want to quote from there. So it was really a fantastically well-crafted rhetorical attack on B.F. Skinner, who is a behaviorist who studied learning in rats, right? So B.F. Skinner said, well, learning is important. It's something that humans are really good at, and we can study it in another animal, but we're trying to make progress here. And the idea was that by the way, this was unbelievably important in terms of the impact it had on cognitive psychology at the time. So you'll hear in a minute what happened. So far as is known, the relevant properties of language can be expressed only by the use of abstract theories, namely mine, right, genitive grammar, describing postulated internal states of the organism, and such theories are excluded a priori from Skinner's science. And it's true, Skinner didn't want to know the details of what's going on in the brain, he just wanted input and output. The immediate consequence is that the Skinnerian must lapse into mysticism, unexplained similarities and generalizations. Well, that's exactly what deep learning is doing. Deep learning figures out what makes 2 things similar, 2 cups similar, and generalizes to new cups. So in fact, it could be done. It's not impossible, we now know, of a sort that cannot be specified. As soon as the discussion touches the world of fact, while the situation is perhaps clearer in the case of language, there is no reason. This is amazing. This is the impact it had was basically, he said, this is never going to work for language, right? And there is no reason to suppose that other aspects of human behavior will fall within the grasp of science. This is like, dripping of disparagement, constrained by prior Skinnerian restrictions. He was wrong. He was dead wrong. And in fact, these networks are particularly good at language. right? And how could it be? Let's analyze this argument. Okay, here's the argument. Let me boil it down. I cannot imagine that any learning being done is capable of being able to account for something as complex as language. And if I can't imagine it, then it's impossible. It's an argument from ignorance. Do not trust any expert that tells you something is impossible, because it probably means somebody is now working on it that will figure out how to do it. And I can give other examples too, but this is my favorite. Okay, now I'm going to very quickly now go through a couple of examples very quickly of what to expect in the future. Everybody here has heard about self-driving cars. Every company, Google, Apple now, car companies are building these cars. It all started in 2005 when Sebastian Thrun won a contest, $2 million from DARPA for driving an autonomous vehicle across the California desert. Okay, what's going to happen when self-driving cars are available freely? Okay. Well, first of all, if you could press a button and the car shows up and takes you somewhere, right, anywhere you want to go, you don't need a car. We already have Uber, but it has a driver in it, but now you don't have a driver, right? And 80% of the cost of Uber is the driver. Now, if you don't have, the cars that you're using right now only are being used 4% of the time, which means that 96% of the time, all the cars in the world are not being used. Where are they? They're in parking lots. Well, if we don't need parking lots anymore, we can use that space, all the space around malls, all the space in downtown, valuable real estate, right? Parking structures. That can all be raised and that can be used for parks and for all kinds of things. There's an enormous amount of value that's going to be freed up. And this is just the beginning. There's a whole company, these cars talk to each other. They're not going to bang into each other. They're going to figure out how to keep track of things. And they're going to be more efficient in terms of going places. Auto body shops won't be needed anymore, will they? Insurance companies won't be needed anymore because there'll be fewer accidents. Fewer deaths from people who are falling asleep on the road. We lose 40,000 people from people who are falling asleep on the road every year. Or drunk drivers. Just look at this. It went right through my God, what was this driver thinking? It went right through the windshield, right? This is the guardrail. And it just stopped here because of the fact that there was a little vertical here, right? This happens every day. I'm not exaggerating this, right? This is kind of the way we're living in a world right now where basically people are killing themselves out on the road. The most dangerous thing you can do is get in your car. And then finally, this is my favorite. Average person in the U.S. commutes 26 miles one way. And if you add up all the hours that are spent commuting, it's 3.5 million human years per year that could be freed up to do anything else. That's a huge amount of human cognitive bandwidth that is being lost. And finally, who in his right mind would steal a self-driving car when it can drive itself home? It's the end of Grand Theft Auto. Okay, and that's just one example that I'm aware of and that where we've worked out some of the consequences. We have no idea. I mean, nobody can predict the future. But it's going to be professions. It's not going to just be drivers. It's going to be doctors. It's going to be lawyers, high-paying professionals. For example, this is a paper in Nature in which Sebastian Thrun, the same guy who won that autonomous vehicle race for DARPA, trained up a deep learning network to recognize 2,000 types of skin lesions better than professionals, the experts. And that means, now just think about it, if you have a little mole or something that you're worried about, you have to make a appointment, you go into the skin doctor, take a picture, they look at it, maybe, then you get a call a couple weeks later and say, well, it's malignant, it's too bad, it's too late, you should have brought it in earlier, right? Well, that can all be replaced. You take out your cell phone, click a picture, it goes up to the cloud, it comes back, there's nothing to worry about, it's just a mole. Or get into a doctor's office immediately because your life is compromised, right? And then just think how many lives are going to be saved with better diagnosis because of the fact that you have a bigger database than most doctors have. And finally, and this is something that happens only once every a couple of decades when a national grand challenge is announced, and this is back in 1961 when John F. Kennedy announced that the United States was going to the moon. How many people remember that? Okay, I put my hand up too. So this had an enormous impact on the United States and the world, okay? And so at the time when he made his announcement, we didn't have a rocket that was big enough, we didn't have computers that were fast enough, we didn't have materials that would bring us back through the atmosphere. Basically, he was just hoping. This is a Hail Mary, right? We're going to do this, right? What was the average age of an engineer when Kennedy stood on, when Neil Armstrong stood on the moon? 26. And that means back in 1961, they were in school, just like students in your classes. They were inspired, and they actually did it. That's the amazing thing. But I now ask you, if the moon was so important, why is it we didn't go back? Well, first of all, it costs $100 billion, so it's expensive. But it turns out that the real benefit isn't the moon. The benefit was that it was a $100 billion investment in the economy, in the satellite industry, which we dominated, the microelectronics that we dominated, material science, and it goes on and on and on. It turns out that we're still benefiting from it, 50, 60 years later. And so here we are, okay? Another president of the United States, Barack Obama, goes in the White House on April 2nd and announces a brain initiative, which is a similar grand challenge. And his basic argument was, look, we're really on the verge here of understanding something that is incredibly complex, but we can't do it with current tools. We've got to get engineers to work together with our biologists to crack these really difficult problems. And the I and the N in brain stand for innovative neurotechnologies. And it's amazing what's happened over the last 3 years, 4 years. It's just zoomed ahead. And I'll give you one example. Well, first, I was asked by the director of NIH, Francis Collins, to sit on a committee of 14 others to come up with a report on how to spend $5 billion over 10 years on the BRAIN initiative. And so we met for about a year. We talked to a lot of people. We came up with a report. It's online. You can Google it if you want, BRAIN 2025. And he asked us to set priorities, milestones, the costs, and it was very difficult to come up with a consensus because we all had the silly idea that what we were doing is more important than anything else. But it turns out that the thread that went through all of these different priorities was the fact that we're generating big data by recording from more neurons, reconstructing bigger anatomical networks, behavior, right? All those are creating huge data sets, and that machine learning was going to be important for all of them. It's all about data. It's all about extracting information from the data. And it's going to get worse. So this is an interesting graph. It's date, time, starting from 1960. And this is the number, each dot is a paper. And in that paper, they recorded simultaneously from, say, 10 neurons at the same time. So you can see at the beginning, it was one neuron at the same time. And now we're up to about, at this point, 2003, up to about 100. Well, let's extrapolate it. Okay, we want to get up to about 1 million. That's what it's going to take to really crack the brain. Well, extrapolating this up, you can see even on this log scale, it's going to take us 100 years. I'm not going to be around. You're all going to have Alzheimer's before we get there. So here's what the goal is. The goal is to accelerate the research by developing tools and techniques to record over the next 10 years so we can reach that goal by 2025. And we are right on track. This is amazing. And I'm going to show you a movie just to illustrate this. This is a zebrafish, which has the advantage that its brain is transparent, which means you can see the whole thing. And this is a light sheet microscope that can go up and down, so you can see every neuron. It has about 80,000 neurons. Each of these little spots here is a neuron that is being activated. It's actually a calcium signal, but it's a surrogate for a lot of spikes. And you can see that this is from the top, this is from the side, and this is from the front. So the movie, I hope, will play, and you'll see what's called spontaneous activity. This is just there's no stimulus. It's in the dark, and the animal is immobilized. There's the motor activity. This is just the zebrafish thinking. What is it thinking? This is the forebrain. These are the eyes, the visual system. Something. The zebrafish probably had this sudden realization, right? Maybe it's a default mode network, you know? But it really is a challenge because, you know, this is something that we've always wanted, and it's the Chinese curse. May you get what you wish for. And now we've got to make sense of this, and this is the challenge. And this is where machine learning is going to be a very great help. Now, just before the announcement was made, a small group of us were asked to wait for the president, and just before this photo was taken, it was 10 minutes before the actual announcement when this photo was taken. And I just want to point out a few people. This is Francis Collins, the lead organization, Core Merit, NSF, Arati Prabhakar, DARPA, and this is actually the person who actually created this whole project is a Mi-Young Chun, who is the science officer at the Kavli Foundation, a small foundation located in Santa Barbara, California. And she was the one who had this idea that instead of going for a disease, you go after basic fundamental technology. And that sold the day. That was really amazing that she was able to do that with the help of a lot of other people who are here. I won't go into the details. Now, just before as we were lining up, I was talking to Arati, and here I am talking to the director of DARPA, and I said, this is a great place to network, you know, because we were talking about projects that, you know, we were thinking about doing, and DARPA has actually taken the lead on working on humans, implanting them and recording from them and stimulating them. And this is really amazing that they're doing this. Well, as I was talking to Arati, somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around, and there was Obama towering over me. He is much taller in person than he looks from photos. Either that or I'm a lot shorter than I think. But I was completely unprepared. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was say, "Thank you, Mr. President." And thank you.